Here's a look at the wheel bearing assembly. This is the rear. The front is pretty much exactly the same, except for the fact that you don't have a drive shaft that comes through the middle of the hub. You have just sort of a blank which gets bolted on. But the drive shaft would come through here. It would come through the inside of that and get bolted on a whopping great big nut at the front. So we remove that. And then what we want to do is remove this thing. And this is assuming, because this is all out of the car, because the drive shaft needs to be removed. We need to remove this, and then you'll see the bearing on the inside. What will most likely happen is that cup will, which is on there, that was all the way down to there, will come with this, so that'll be stuck on there, and we'll need to remove that. But the wheel bearing is pressed into here. There are two rows. You can see there's the outer row there, which is what that cup was slotted into. There's another one on the inside, but the bearing itself is pressed into that. Over the top of that, once that happens, is we put this with 4 bolts that holds it on, and then this gets pressed into that, and then the drive shaft comes through after we fit it to the car, and we bolt the thing down. To get this apart requires some tools. You will probably need a bearing puller and a hub puller. But the way to get this off is once we get the drive shaft out and that nut is off, I need to pull this off. Now, a couple of ways of doing that. We can either use a pulling tool with a slide hammer. So you bolt it to this and you just whack that out, and that will pull it out of the interference fit, which is on that. This will come with it, but it'll pull it out of the rear part of the bearing, and then we'll need to separate this from the hub. And then to remove this piece here, we need to remove it out of this housing here. On both the front and rear wheel carriers, there's the wheel speed sensor, which lives in here. It's just got a single Allen key screw that comes out to remove that. I would suggest, especially if you're going to remove bearings or drive shafts or anything like that, to take that out. And the reason is on the underside, that is where it sticks out, and clearly you don't want to knock that and break that. So I'd be pulling that out pretty much as one of the first things I did, and then put it back in as one of the last. And so with the thing propped up on a couple of bits of timber just on the park brake pads there, it's clear of the bench, and using a socket that's small enough, I can just whack that out from the inside. There we go. And as you'll see, what will happen is you'll get the one side of the bearing, the cone for one side will stay with that, and we'll pull that off in a moment. But this side here will stay in place, and we're going to remove these 4 screws and this plate that holds everything in place, and then we will push it out from the other side. You'll notice that on the outside here, this part of the dust seal has come off with it. So to get my bearing puller in underneath here, I'm just going to put this in the vise and lever this off, and that's going to give me better access to underneath there. So to remove that piece of the bearing, I'm just going to use a bearing puller. It's an old piece of steel there, just so I've got something to press against. And that should just pull it up and off. And as you can see, that's starting to pull that off that bearing piece off there now. And once it gets up to about here, because obviously with that piece of metal there, it's not going to be able to pull that over the top of that, so I'm just going to use that socket again and put the metal over the top of that. To remove the bearing from the wheel carrier, I'm just going to use a bush removal tool. You could use a press, but this is what I've got, so this is what I'm going to use. Basically, the bearing gets held in there, and This is bigger than the outside of the bearing. You wind this together and it basically just pulls it straight through from one side to the other. Now getting the thing started took a fair bit of force, but then once it starts to move, it's not so bad. And there's the bearing there. To install the bearing, I'm going to use the same bushing removal and install kit. At the back, I'm going to pull it in with one that's obviously a little bit larger than that. And at the front, when we push this in, it's important to push it in on the outside bit. It doesn't necessarily have to be smaller than that. It can be about the same size because it's going to be pushed flush to this. It could be a bit bigger. As long as it's firmly faced on the outside ring, that's what counts. Prior to installing the bearing, just put a light layer of grease on the outside and on the inside here. This is going to help that go in a little bit more easily. And when on the install, the silver face was on the outside. I'm not sure if it makes any difference. It's still a metal shield on the inside, but I'm going to put that silver face on the outside. Looking at where the wheel speed sensor is here in relation to the bearing, it seems as though there's no pulse wheel on the drive shaft, because there's the drive shaft there. There's no pulse wheel there. That's just all steel. And the bearing on this side here seems to have a rubber shield. On the other side, it's metal. So it seems to be critical that you put the rubber side on the inside next to the pulse wheel, because it seems to count the actual ball bearings inside as they go past to determine the wheel speed. And as you're pulling this in, when you first put it in, it should go in fairly easily, but check that it's going in straight. What you don't want it to do is go in at an angle. And then once you get going, occasionally I like to just loosen it off a little bit, make sure everything's aligned, because at the other side, if it's not perfectly centered, it's going to try and pull it sideways a little bit. So I would just loosen it every so often and then just retighten it and then pull it all the way down. Okay, so that's all the way home now. To push the hub back in, I'm going to use a bush install kit. I've got a really big ring around the outside of the entire hub, which centers it really nicely. And on the underside, it's pressing on the inside race of the bearing. You definitely don't want to be whacking this in from the outside. You need to press it in because you need to pull it against the bearing there, otherwise it will knock that out the other side. One of the difficulties with this is getting this centered and going in straight to start off with. So press it in a little bit and just give it a tap with a mallet and rotate that around and check that it's even. You can watch that from the side and check that it's not going in sideways. Otherwise, if it's going to get stuck in skew-if, it's going to be fairly difficult to get everything centered up again. Once you've pressed the hub in there, you want to make sure that's all the way home. At the top and bottom, there are little cutouts in this piece here that holds the bearing. Just in there, you can shine a torch down there and check that it's seated correctly against the bearing. That being said, it's not hugely important, because the moment I put the axle through here and tighten that nut, that's going to do exactly the same thing as we just did by pushing this thing in, and by putting 460 Newton meters on that, that is going to squeeze that all together so everything's in the right spot. This is the front bearing assembly. The only difference between the front and the rear is at the rear, this is obviously the drive shaft, but at the front it's just like a blank, which goes to sort of a disky thing on the other side, which we'll pull out in a moment. So when you push this out, I'm just using a 3-jaw puller, that just pops straight out. That took very little effort at all. And on the other side is that. So that's the thing that slots into the splines in there. And the beauty of this is if you've got a slide hammer on a hub puller, you can just pull this out because you're not going to be able to get a hammer on the inside to knock it out. But you don't have to disassemble any of this stuff like you do with the rear. So you don't need to pull out the wheel carrier. Everything can stay in place, and you can replace the bearing with it sitting right there. These nuts here, they talk about replacing. Now clearly they're not talk to yield or anything like that, but I think there are two reasons why they say to replace them. Firstly, they're a cone lock nut, and as long as when you're putting it on, it's going to bind up and lock it, then that would be fine. But also they're a galvanized finish, and with different finishes, you can, for consequent tightening, so the second or third or fourth tightening, the interaction between the different surfaces on the threads, etc., changes, so you don't get the same clamping force when you put everything back together again for consequent tightening. So I would advise lightly oiling these because that's going to take that effect away. You can do it multiple times and the interactions with the surface finishes aren't going to have that effect. If you're struggling to hold the hub whilst you are turning this, and especially when you're putting the axle in, because you'll need to hold it in at the back, easy thing to hold it for you, just put a bolt in there, put a screwdriver down the back there, and that'll just hold it. So when you're turning, you can have an extra hand to go around the back, and also just makes it much easier to put it on and off. Now I'm definitely not going to put that full 460 Newton meters of torque using this method. I'm going to do that once the wheel is on the ground, but this just helps you get the thing home initially. If you've got the disc and the caliper on, the easiest way to hold things is just shove a screwdriver in the slots on the disc, and depending on which way you're rotating it, so for example, if I'm tightening things up, I need to rotate it clockwise from this direction here. I'm going to put it at the top because what I don't want to do is be pulling down onto the anti-rattle clip, and then doing it to undo it, and I'm going to put it down the back so it's pushing at the bottom of the caliper there. And 460 Newton meters is 46 kilos at a distance of 1 meter.